The winter of 1943 brought more than just freezing temperatures to the occupied territories of France. It brought desperation, hunger, and a silence so heavy it seemed to suffocate the very spirit of those who once called these streets home. In the small industrial town of Clermont-Ferrand, nestled in the Auvergne region, the German occupation had transformed daily life into a careful dance between survival and resistance. Every corner held the possibility of danger. Every shadow could conceal an informant, and every sound of boots on cobblestone sent shivers down the spines of those who remembered freedom. Among the factories that now served the German war machine, one particular facility stood as a symbol of both occupation and quiet defiance. The Michelin aircraft component plant, once a source of pride for French engineering, now produced parts for Luftwaffe planes under the watchful eyes of Wehrmacht guards and Nazi overseers. It was here, among the smell of machine oil and hot metal, that our story begins. A story of one man's ingenuity, courage, and the thin line between brilliance and madness that war often creates. If you're enjoying this story of courage and resistance, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories from history that deserve to be remembered. Marcel Beaumont was not a soldier. He had never held a rifle before the occupation, never studied military tactics, never imagined himself as anything more than a skilled machinist with calloused hands and an eye for precision. At 32 years old, he was thin, almost gaunt, with dark circles under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights and the constant gnawing of an empty stomach. His workshop clothes hung loosely on his frame, testament to the meager rations that the occupation had imposed on the French population. But his hands, those were different. They were steady, precise, and held the knowledge of 20 years working with metal, tolerances, and the delicate art of turning raw materials into functional machinery. The factory floor where Marcel worked was a cavern of noise and heat. Massive presses stamped out aluminum sheets with rhythmic thunder. Lathes screamed as they carved steel into specific shapes, and the constant hum of the German supervisors' voices created an atmosphere of tension that never lifted. The November cold seeped through the broken windows high above, mixing with the oppressive heat from the furnaces to create a humid, uncomfortable environment that left workers perpetually exhausted. Marcel stood at his station, a precision lathe that he had operated for over a decade. His fingers moved with practiced efficiency as he shaped a small component for a Messerschmitt fighter's fuel system. Around him, dozens of other French workers performed similar tasks, their faces masks of careful neutrality. Speaking was discouraged. Smiling was suspicious. Any sign of resistance, no matter how small, could result in immediate arrest, or worse. 3 German guards patrolled the floor at all times. They were Wehrmacht soldiers, career military men who took their duties seriously. The youngest, a corporal named Hans, who couldn't have been more than 19, walked past Marcel's station with the rigid posture of someone trying to appear more confident than he felt. The other 2 were older, veterans of the Eastern Front who had been reassigned to occupation duty. Their eyes were harder, their patience thinner, and their willingness to use violence immediate. It was during his lunch break, such as it was, that Marcel made his discovery. The breaks were 15 minutes, barely enough time to eat the thin soup and stale bread that constituted the workers' daily meal. Marcel had developed a habit of walking to the far corner of the factory near the scrap pile, where he could be alone with his thoughts for a few precious moments. The scrap pile was massive, a growing mountain of rejected parts, damaged components, and manufacturing waste that would eventually be melted down and recycled. On this particular day, as light snow began to fall through the broken skylights, Marcel noticed something that made him pause. Partially buried in the scrap heap was a damaged gun barrel from a Browning machine gun, likely from a downed Allied bomber. It was twisted at the end, useless for its original purpose. But Marcel's trained eye saw something different. He saw potential. His heart began to race as an idea formed in his mind. It was dangerous, potentially suicidal, but it was also necessary. For months, he had listened to whispered conversations about resistance cells operating in the mountains south of the city. He had heard rumors of supply drops, of coordinated attacks, of Frenchmen and women fighting back against the occupation. But they needed weapons, and weapons were nearly impossible to obtain. Marcel glanced around quickly. The guards were at the other end of the factory, supervising the loading of finished components onto a truck. With movements that appeared casual but were actually calculated, he shifted some scrap metal to better conceal the gun barrel, marking its location in his memory. His mind was already working, cataloguing other components he had seen in the scrap pile, calculating what might be possible. That evening, as Marcel trudged through the snow-covered streets toward his small apartment, his thoughts were consumed by the possibility taking shape in his mind. The apartment was in a 3-story building that had seen better days. The paint was peeling, several windows were boarded up from bomb damage during the initial invasion, and the heating barely functioned. But it was home, or as close to home as anything could be in these dark times. His wife Claire was waiting for him. She was 28, once vibrant and full of life, now worn down by the constant stress of occupation. Her blonde hair, which she used to wear long and loose, was now pulled back in a tight bun. Her dress, patched and repatched, hung on her frame. But her eyes, those green eyes that Marcel had fallen in love with 10 years ago, still held a spark of defiance. Dinner was potatoes and a small piece of cheese, luxury by current standards. Claire had connections through the local market, quiet exchanges with farmers who still remembered what it meant to be French. They ate in silence for a while, the kind of comfortable silence that comes from years of marriage and shared hardship. Finally, Marcel spoke. His voice was low, barely above a whisper, even though they were alone. In occupied France, walls had ears, and one could never be too careful. He told her about the gun barrel, about the other components he had seen, about an idea that had been forming in his mind all afternoon. Claire listened without interrupting, her face growing paler with each word. When he finished, she was silent for a long moment, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her response was not what he expected. There were no tears, no pleas for him to abandon this dangerous path. Instead, she reached across the table and took his hands in hers. Her grip was firm, her eyes steady as they met his. She told him that her brother Antoine was with the resistance, that she had been helping them with small tasks, passing messages, hiding supplies, that they desperately needed weapons and someone with the technical knowledge to maintain them. That if Marcel could do what he was suggesting, it could make a real difference. Marcel felt the weight of her words settle over him like a heavy coat. This was no longer just his decision, his risk. This was something bigger, something that could help or could destroy them both. But as he looked at his wife's face, at the determination mixed with fear in her expression, he knew there was only one choice to make. Over the following weeks, Marcel began his careful work. Every day at the factory, he would take a few extra minutes near the scrap pile, cataloguing what was available, what could be salvaged, what could be repurposed. The damaged gun barrel became the centerpiece of his plan, but it needed so much more. He found a recoil spring from a damaged aircraft landing gear. The steel was still good, the tension properties intact. He discovered firing pins, trigger mechanisms, and various other small components scattered throughout the scrap. Each piece was carefully noted, its location memorized, its potential use calculated. The challenge was not just finding the parts, it was acquiring them without being noticed. Marcel developed a system. He would work late, volunteering for extra shifts that the Germans were always happy to have filled. During these late hours, when supervision was lighter and the factory was quieter, he would carefully extract small components from the scrap pile, hiding them in the lining of his heavy work coat. The winter deepened. December brought temperatures that turned the Seine to ice and made every breath visible in the frigid air. The factory became even more miserable, but Marcel barely noticed. His mind was consumed by his project, by calculations and measurements, by the growing collection of parts hidden in a false bottom he had constructed in the floor of his apartment. Claire became his partner in this dangerous endeavor. She created diversions when he worked late, visiting the factory to bring him dinner and chatting with guards to distract them. She established connections with the resistance through her brother, preparing them for what Marcel was attempting to create. By mid-December, Marcel had collected nearly everything he needed, but the most dangerous part was yet to come, actually constructing the weapon. This couldn't be done at the factory, not with German supervisors constantly present. It had to be done at home, in the middle of the night, with tools that wouldn't make noise, that could alert neighbors or passing patrols. He worked by candlelight in the small storage room of their apartment, using hand tools and quiet files to shape metal with painstaking precision. The gun barrel had to be straightened, a process that took 3 nights of careful heating and pressing. The trigger mechanism had to be rebuilt from scratch, using springs and catches from various sources. The stock was carved from an old table leg, shaped to fit against the shoulder and provide stability. Each night as he worked, Claire would sit by the door, knitting quietly but listening intently for any sounds in the hallway. They had agreed on a signal. If she dropped the knitting needles, Marcel would immediately hide everything and they would pretend to be asleep. The construction took 6 weeks, 6 weeks of fear, of sleepless nights, of constant anxiety that a random search might discover what they were doing. But slowly, impossibly, a functioning weapon began to take shape. It was crude, ugly even, but Marcel's expertise had created something that worked. By late January of 1944, the weapon was complete. It was a semi-automatic rifle, chambered for the common 8mm Mauser rounds that the Germans used, meaning ammunition could potentially be scavenged from enemy positions. The barrel was longer than standard, giving it good accuracy at distance. The stock was solid, the trigger mechanism responsive, and the recoil system functional. The test would come soon, but first, the weapon had to be delivered to the resistance. Claire's brother Antoine had been operating with a small cell in the mountains south of Clermont-Ferrand for over a year. They had conducted minor sabotage operations, intelligence gathering, and had helped several Allied pilots escape to Spain. But they were woefully underarmed, with only a handful of weapons among their group of 20 fighters. The handoff was arranged for a moonless night in early February. Marcel would meet Antoine at an abandoned mill on the outskirts of town, a location that provided cover and multiple escape routes. The risk was enormous. German patrols had been increased recently, and the penalty for weapons possession was immediate execution. Marcel wrapped the rifle in canvas and oilcloth, making it appear to be nothing more than scrap metal or tools. He and Claire walked through the frozen streets, moving separately but maintaining visual contact. The night was brutally cold, the kind of cold that made your teeth ache and your fingers numb even through gloves. The mill appeared suddenly through the darkness, a hulking shadow against the star-filled sky. Marcel approached carefully, giving the coded whistle that Antoine had taught Claire. For a terrifying moment, there was no response. Then, from inside the mill, an answering whistle. Antoine was there with 2 other men from his cell. They were young, perhaps early 20s, with the lean, hard look of men who lived rough and moved fast. Their eyes held a mixture of hope and skepticism as Marcel unwrapped the rifle. In the dim light of a shielded lantern, Marcel demonstrated his creation. He showed them how to load it, how to clear malfunctions, how to maintain the mechanisms. The men listened intently, occasionally asking technical questions that showed they understood the basics of firearms. Antoine took the rifle, feeling its weight, testing its balance. He raised it to his shoulder, sighted down the barrel, and nodded slowly. His question was direct and necessary. Would it actually work in combat? Marcel's response was honest. He had designed it to the best of his ability, had tested the mechanisms as much as possible without actually firing it, but until it was used in real conditions, there was no guarantee. The rifle was as much a hope as it was a weapon. They talked for nearly an hour, discussing tactics, potential targets, and the growing resistance operations. Antoine revealed that several other cells were becoming more active, that coordination was improving, and that there were plans for larger operations in the spring. Every weapon made a difference, and this rifle, crude as it was, represented something more than firepower. It represented French ingenuity, French resistance, French refusal to surrender. As they prepared to part ways, Antoine pulled Marcel aside. His words were soft but intense. The resistance was growing, he said, but it needed more than weapons. It needed people with skills, with knowledge, with the courage to use both against the occupation. He asked if Marcel would consider doing more than just building weapons. Marcel looked at his wife, standing a few meters away, her face pale in the darkness. He thought about the factory, about the daily humiliation of serving the German war effort, about the slow starvation of his people. His answer came slowly, but with certainty. He would help however he could. The next weeks brought a new routine. Marcel continued his work at the factory, but now he was also gathering intelligence. He noted production schedules, guard rotations, weak points in security. He identified which German supervisors were most vigilant and which were complacent. All of this information was passed through Claire to the resistance. In early March, the first report came back. The rifle had been used in an ambush of a small German patrol on a mountain road. 3 soldiers had been killed, weapons and ammunition captured. The rifle had performed exactly as designed, firing reliably and accurately. Antoine sent a message through the network. Could Marcel build more? The answer was complicated. One weapon had been difficult enough, requiring months of careful scavenging and dangerous construction. But multiple weapons would require a different approach, more risk and more resources. Marcel began to think bigger. He started recruiting. Carefully, quietly, he identified other workers at the factory who might be sympathetic. He watched for small signs. A furtive glance when the German supervisors weren't looking, a muttered curse under someone's breath, the way certain men walked slower when carrying components for German aircraft. His first recruit was Louis, a 45-year-old toolmaker who had fought in the First World War. Louis had the weathered face of a man who had seen too much and the steady hands of an experienced craftsman. Marcel approached him during a late shift, speaking in coded phrases about disappointment in their work, about missing the days when they built things for France. Louis's response was measured but clear. He too had been thinking about resistance. He too was willing to take risks. Within a week, he was helping Marcel identify and acquire components, creating false reports to explain missing or damaged parts. By April, they had recruited 4 more men. The cell was small, tight-knit, and highly cautious. They moved slowly, taking no unnecessary risks, but the production of weapons began to accelerate. 2 more rifles were completed by late April, along with several improvised grenades constructed from factory materials, but success brought attention. The Germans had noticed the increase in resistance activity. Patrols were strengthened, informant networks expanded, and security at the factory tightened. A new SS officer, Hauptsturmführer Klaus Richter, was assigned to oversee the facility. He was young for his rank, perhaps 30, with cold blue eyes and a reputation for ruthless efficiency. Richter implemented immediate changes. Random searches became daily occurrences. Workers were required to pass through inspection points when entering and leaving. The scrap pile was organized and catalogued, making it nearly impossible to remove materials unnoticed. Several workers suspected of minor infractions were arrested and publicly interrogated. Marcel knew they needed to accelerate their timeline. The noose was tightening, and it was only a matter of time before they were discovered. The resistance needed a major victory, something that would justify the risks they had taken and provide cover for their activities. The opportunity came in late April. Intelligence reached the resistance that a high-ranking German general would be traveling through the region on May 10th, inspecting defensive positions in preparation for the anticipated Allied invasion. The route would take him past a narrow section of road in the mountains, a perfect location for an ambush. The resistance leadership decided to attempt the operation. It would require most of their available fighters, all of their weapons, and perfect timing. Antoine requested that Marcel join them, not just as the creator of their weapons, but as a combatant. The decision tore at Marcel. He was not a soldier, had never killed a man, had never truly imagined himself in combat. But he also knew that his technical knowledge might be crucial if weapons malfunctioned, and his presence would demonstrate his commitment to the cause. Claire did not try to stop him. Instead, she helped him prepare, checking his equipment, making sure he had warm clothes and what little food they could spare. On the night before he was to leave, they sat together in their small apartment, not speaking much, just being together in case it was the last time. The morning of May 9th, Marcel left the apartment before dawn, telling neighbors he was going to visit relatives in the countryside. He carried a small pack with supplies and wore his heavy work coat. The rifles and other weapons had already been transported to the ambush site by other resistance members. The journey south into the mountains took most of the day. Marcel traveled with Louis and 2 other factory workers, moving carefully along back roads and forest paths. The spring weather was unpredictable, with sudden rain showers followed by brilliant sunshine that made the wet forest steam. They reached the resistance camp as darkness fell. It was not much of a camp, just a small clearing in dense forest with a few makeshift shelters. About 30 men and women were gathered there, the combined strength of 3 separate resistance cells brought together for this operation. Antoine greeted Marcel with a firm embrace. He looked different here, in his element, no longer just a name passed in whispered messages, but a leader of men. He introduced Marcel to the other commanders, explained the plan, and showed him where the weapons were stored. Marcel inspected each rifle carefully, checking mechanisms, testing springs, ensuring everything was in proper working order. The weapons he had built looked crude, next to the few British Sten guns and American carbines that had been airdropped to the resistance, but they were solid and reliable. The plan was straightforward, but dangerous. The German convoy would consist of several vehicles, scout cars front and rear, a staff car in the middle carrying the general and his officers, and trucks with infantry support. The resistance would position themselves on both sides of the narrow road, allowing the convoy to enter a kill zone before opening fire simultaneously. Timing was critical. They would have perhaps 30 seconds of surprise before the Germans could organize a response. In that time, they needed to disable the vehicles, eliminate as many soldiers as possible, and then withdraw before German reinforcements arrived. Marcel was assigned to the southern position, along with Louis and 5 other fighters. Their job was to focus on the rear scout car and prevent the infantry from dismounting and taking cover. The rifles Marcel had built would be crucial here, providing accurate fire at the medium ranges typical of this terrain. They moved into position in the pre-dawn darkness of May 10th. The location was well chosen, a section of road that curved around a steep hillside with thick forest on both sides. The Germans would have to slow down for the curve, and the terrain limited their options for escape or maneuver. Marcel crouched behind a fallen log, his rifle positioned on the weathered bark for stability. His heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat. Around him, the other fighters were similarly positioned, their faces tense with anticipation and fear. Hours passed. The sun rose, burning off the morning mist and warming the forest floor. Birds sang, oblivious to the violence being prepared. Marcel's legs began to cramp from holding his position, but he didn't dare move. Then, just before noon, the signal came. A soft bird call from the scouts positioned up the road. The convoy was approaching. Marcel could hear them before he could see them. The distinctive rumble of German military vehicles echoing off the hillsides. His hands tightened on the rifle. Every sense seemed heightened. He could smell the pine needles and damp earth, could feel the rough bark beneath his fingers, could hear his own breathing loud in his ears. The first vehicle appeared around the curve, a scout car with a mounted machine gun. Behind it came the staff car, black and gleaming despite the dusty roads. Then the trucks, 2 of them, canvas-covered and full of soldiers. Antoine's signal was a single gunshot that shattered the peaceful mountain air. Chaos erupted. Marcel fired at the rear scout car, his first shot punching through the windshield. The driver slumped forward and the vehicle swerved, crashing into a tree. Around him, the forest exploded with gunfire. The homemade rifles barked in a ragged chorus, mixing with the sharper crack of the British weapons and the chatter of a captured German machine gun. The German infantry were reacting, trying to dismount from the trucks, but the resistance fire was withering. Marcel worked his rifle methodically, just as he worked his lathe at the factory, with precision and focus. Aim, breathe, squeeze, work the bolt, acquire new target. One of his rifles jammed after the 3rd shot, but he cleared it quickly, his factory training serving him well. Soldiers were falling, screaming, trying to find cover. The staff car attempted to reverse, but shots from the other side of the road shattered its tires and engine. German officers spilled out, seeking cover behind the disabled vehicle. The firefight lasted perhaps 3 minutes, though it felt like hours. Marcel fired until his rifle was empty, reloaded with shaking hands, and fired again. Louis, beside him, was shouting something, but Marcel couldn't hear over the roar of gunfire and his own pounding heart. Then, as quickly as it began, it was over. Antoine's whistle pierced the air, the signal to withdraw. The resistance fighters melted back into the forest, moving quickly along pre-planned escape routes. Marcel ran, his legs burning, branches whipping his face. Behind him, he could hear German voices shouting, sporadic gunfire as the survivors attempted to organize a pursuit. But the resistance knew these mountains, knew every trail and hiding spot. They regrouped 3 kilometers away, in a dense thicket that provided cover. Antoine quickly counted heads, 2 fighters wounded, none killed. On the German side, the results were devastating. Preliminary estimates suggested at least 15 enemy dead, including several officers. The general himself had been wounded but survived, evacuated by helicopter that arrived 30 minutes after the ambush. Marcel sat against a tree, his rifle across his lap, still processing what had happened. He had killed men today. The knowledge sat heavy in his stomach, mixing with adrenaline and exhaustion. Louis clapped him on the shoulder, saying something about the rifles performing perfectly, but Marcel barely heard. The journey back took 2 days, moving carefully to avoid German patrols that were now swarming the area. When Marcel finally reached Clermont-Ferrand, the city was in lockdown. The German response to the ambush had been swift and brutal. Random arrests, public interrogations, executions of suspected resistance sympathizers. Marcel returned to work at the factory, playing the role of the innocent machinist who had been away visiting sick relatives. Hauptsturmführer Richter watched everyone with increased suspicion, but without proof, even the SS had to be careful about arresting skilled workers critical to production. The ambush became legendary in the resistance network. The story of the rifles built from aircraft scraps by a factory worker spread, growing with each retelling. Marcel's creation was proof that the French could still fight, could still strike back against their oppressors with ingenuity and courage. But the immediate aftermath brought a wave of German fury that swept through Clermont-Ferrand like a winter storm. Hauptsturmführer Richter personally oversaw the investigation, his cold blue eyes seeming to pierce through every worker at the factory. He instituted new security measures that bordered on paranoia: strip searches at random intervals, surveillance of workers' homes, interrogations that lasted for hours over the smallest infractions. Marcel returned to work 3 days after the ambush, his heart pounding as he passed through the factory gates. The guard who checked his papers looked at him with tired eyes, the kind of exhaustion that came from too many hours on duty and too much pressure from superiors. The factory floor had changed. Where there had once been a certain rhythm to the work, now there was only tension. Louis was already at his station when Marcel arrived, and the brief eye contact they shared communicated volumes. They couldn't speak, couldn't acknowledge what they had done, but they both knew. Around them, other workers moved like shadows, heads down, avoiding any action that might draw attention. Richter made his presence felt immediately. He walked the factory floor with 2 SS guards, stopping randomly to inspect work, to question workers about their production rates, to remind everyone that the Reich demanded perfection and that failure would not be tolerated. His voice, when he spoke, was precise and cutting, each word chosen to intimidate. Marcel focused on his lathe, his hands moving with the practiced precision of years. But his mind was racing, calculating risks, considering next steps. The ambush had been successful beyond their hopes, but it had also made continued operations nearly impossible. The scrap pile was now guarded around the clock. Random inspections of workers' coats and bags happened multiple times per shift. Even taking home a single bolt would be noticed. The week dragged on with agonizing slowness. Each day felt like a month as Marcel waited for the inevitable knock on his door, the arrest that would mean torture and execution. Claire barely slept, starting at every sound in the hallway, every passing vehicle on the street below. They spoke in whispers, even in their own apartment, trusting nothing and no one. On the 5th day after the ambush, the Gestapo came, but not for Marcel. They arrested Henri, a young worker who had joined the factory only 6 months earlier. Marcel had never recruited him, had never even spoken to him about resistance activities, but someone had informed on him for making disparaging comments about Hitler. Henri was taken from the factory floor in broad daylight, his protests echoing off the high ceiling as 2 Gestapo officers dragged him toward the exit. The message was clear. The Germans were watching everyone, listening to everything, and the slightest misstep would result in immediate consequences. That night, Marcel and Claire received a coded message through the network. Antoine wanted to meet, urgently. The location was different this time, a bombed-out building in the old part of town that provided multiple escape routes and good visibility of approaching threats. Marcel arrived first, moving through the ruins with careful steps. The building had taken a direct hit during the initial invasion in 1940, and 3 years later it remained a skeleton of shattered walls and collapsed floors. The spring evening was warm, and the smell of blooming flowers mixed incongruously with the scent of old smoke and decay. Antoine emerged from the shadows, and Marcel was shocked by his appearance. His brother-in-law had always been lean, but now he was gaunt, almost skeletal. His clothes were filthy, and there was a fresh bandage on his left arm, spotted with blood that had seeped through the fabric. They embraced briefly, and Antoine's first question was direct: could Marcel continue building weapons? The ambush had proven the value of his rifles, and other resistance cells across the region were desperate for arms. The Allied invasion was coming, everyone knew it, and when it did, every weapon would count. Marcel explained the situation at the factory. The increased security, the impossibility of acquiring materials, but even as he spoke, his mind was working on alternative solutions. He asked Antoine about resources the resistance might have, about captured equipment, about other possibilities. What followed was an intense discussion that lasted nearly 2 hours. Antoine revealed information that Marcel had not known. The resistance had established a hidden workshop in an abandoned quarry 30 kilometers south of the city. They had basic tools, some captured German equipment, and access to occasional supply drops from Allied aircraft. What they lacked was someone with the technical knowledge to effectively use these resources. The proposal was simple, but terrifying. Marcel would leave the factory, go underground completely, and work full-time for the resistance as a weapons specialist. He would modify captured German weapons, repair equipment, and train other fighters in basic firearms maintenance. The work would be dangerous, the living conditions harsh, and there would be no going back. Marcel asked for time to discuss it with Claire. Antoine agreed, but warned that time was running short. The Germans were planning a major offensive against resistance groups in the region, and they needed to be ready. The walk home took Marcel through streets he had known his entire life, but they felt foreign now, occupied not just by German soldiers, but by fear itself. Every corner held memories of better times. The cafe where he and Claire had their first date, now shuttered and dark. The park where children once played, now patrolled by Wehrmacht soldiers. The cinema where they had watched films, now showing only German propaganda. Claire was awake when he arrived, sitting in the dark apartment with a single candle burning. Before he could speak, she told him she had made a decision. She had been thinking about their future, about what kind of life they could have under occupation, about what kind of people they wanted to be when this was all over. She wanted them to join the resistance full-time, not just Marcel, but both of them. She had skills too. She could cook, she could tend wounds, she could help in dozens of ways. The life they had now was not really living, she said. It was just existing, just surviving day to day under the boot of occupation. At least with the resistance, they would be fighting for something, working toward liberation. Marcel listened to his wife speak, watched the candlelight play across her face, and felt something shift inside him. She was right. They had been living in fear for so long that it had become normal. But it wasn't life. Not really. And if they were going to risk everything anyway, better to risk it for a cause that mattered. They made their plans carefully over the following days. They couldn't just disappear without explanation. That would bring immediate suspicion on anyone they had associated with. Instead, they crafted a story. Claire's elderly mother in Lyon was dying, and they needed to go care for her. It was plausible enough, and Lyon was far enough away that verification would be difficult. Marcel gave his notice at the factory, enduring Richter's suspicious questioning with carefully rehearsed answers. He provided forged documents about his mother-in-law's illness, created by the resistance network. After 2 weeks of bureaucratic delays and investigations, his exit papers were finally approved. On a rainy morning in late May, Marcel and Claire walked out of Clermont-Ferrand for the last time as ordinary citizens. They carried 2 small bags with their few possessions, leaving behind an apartment full of memories and a life that had become impossible to maintain. The journey to the resistance camp took 3 days, moving carefully along routes established by the network. They traveled mostly at night, sleeping in barns and safe houses during the day. The French countryside was beautiful in late spring, with fields of green wheat and wildflowers blooming along the roadsides, but it was also dangerous, crisscrossed by German patrols and informants. The quarry that served as the resistance workshop was hidden in a densely forested valley. accessible only by a narrow dirt road that was carefully camouflaged. The main workshop was in a large cave that had been carved into the quarry wall decades earlier when the site was still in operation. It provided natural protection from aerial observation and weather, with enough space for multiple workstations. Marcel's first impression was of organized chaos. Workbenches made from salvaged lumber held an assortment of tools, some professional grade, others improvised from whatever materials were available. Weapons, in various states of disassembly, were scattered across surfaces, and the smell of gun oil mixed with the damp earth scent of the cave. He was introduced to the other members of the workshop team: Jacques, a former gunsmith from Marseille who had escaped north after the occupation of Vichy France; Marie, a chemistry student who specialized in explosives; and Thomas, a teenager of barely 17 who had an uncanny gift for mechanical repair despite no formal training. The work began immediately. Marcel assessed what they had: a dozen captured German rifles, most in poor condition, several British Sten guns dropped by parachute, a collection of pistols of various makes, and boxes of ammunition, some of it damaged or corroded. His factory training served him well as he organized the workspace, established maintenance protocols, and began the systematic work of getting every weapon into fighting condition. Claire proved invaluable in ways neither of them had anticipated. She established a medical station in a smaller cave nearby, using knowledge gained from a brief stint as a nurse's aide before the war. She also took over logistics, managing supplies, coordinating with other resistance cells, and ensuring that fighters had what they needed when they needed it. Life in the resistance camp was harsh, but purposeful. They slept on straw mattresses in caves, ate whatever food could be scavenged or provided by sympathetic farmers, and worked long hours under the constant threat of discovery. But there was also a sense of community, of shared purpose, that had been missing from their lives in occupied Clermont-Ferrand. Marcel continued to innovate. Using components from crashed aircraft that resistance fighters brought to the quarry, he built 2 more rifles similar to his original design. He also created a simple but effective modification to the British Sten guns that reduced their tendency to jam, a common problem with the mass-produced weapons. The intelligence network brought news regularly. The Allied invasion had begun in Normandy on June 6th. The liberation of France had started. The resistance received orders to increase their activities, to disrupt German communications and supply lines, to tie down troops that might otherwise be sent to fight the Allies. Marcel's weapons were used in a series of operations throughout June and July: ambushes on supply convoys, attacks on communication installations, sabotage of railway lines. Each operation was carefully planned, executed with precision, and designed to maximize damage while minimizing resistance casualties. The German response was brutal. Entire villages suspected of harboring resistance fighters were destroyed. Hostages were taken and executed. The SS launched sweeps through the countryside, burning forests and searching caves. Several times, the quarry camp had to be evacuated, with everyone hiding in pre-prepared positions, while German patrols passed within meters of their location. In early August, disaster struck. A resistance courier was captured and, under torture, revealed the approximate location of the quarry workshop. Marcel and the others had perhaps 6 hours warning before a major German force would arrive. The evacuation was frantic but organized. Weapons, ammunition, and essential tools were packed onto carts and carried into the forest. Evidence of the workshop was destroyed or concealed. The resistance fighters split into small groups, each taking different routes to prearranged rally points. Marcel and Claire, along with Jacques and Marie, formed one group. They moved quickly through the forest, carrying as much equipment as they could manage. Behind them, they could hear the sounds of German troops arriving at the quarry. shouted orders, the rumble of vehicles, the occasional burst of gunfire as soldiers shot at shadows. They walked for 12 hours straight, only stopping briefly to rest and redistribute weight. By dawn, they were 30 kilometers away, hidden in a barn owned by a farmer who was part of the resistance network. The farmer, an old man named Philippe, who had lost 2 sons in the First World War, brought them food and information. The Germans had found the quarry, but it was empty. They had spent hours searching, had brought in dogs and technical experts, but found nothing they could use to track the resistance. The workshop was re-established in a new location, this time in a series of interconnected root cellars beneath an abandoned monastery. The work continued now with even greater urgency. News from the front was encouraging. The Allies were breaking out of Normandy, pushing the Germans back. Liberation was coming, but it would take months, and every day until then was a day when the resistance had to keep fighting. Marcel lost track of time, measured his days only by the work completed and the operations supported. He built, he modified, he repaired. His hands, already calloused from years of factory work, became even rougher, stained permanently with gun oil and metal filings. In September, Antoine was killed in an ambush that went wrong. The news hit Claire hard. She withdrew for days, speaking little, moving through her tasks with mechanical precision. Marcel didn't know how to help her grieve. They were all grieving all the time for the dead and the missing and the life that had been taken from them. By October, American forces were approaching from the west, and the German occupation was collapsing. But it was a slow, violent collapse, with the Germans fighting desperate rearguard actions and the SS executing suspected resistance members even as their regime crumbled. The final liberation of Clermont-Ferrand came in late October. Marcel and Claire were not there to see it. They were still with the resistance, still supporting operations against retreating German forces. But when they finally returned in November, walking into a city that was free but scarred, the emotion was overwhelming. They spent the remainder of the war continuing their work with the resistance, now supporting the regular French forces as they pursued the Germans eastward. Marcel's expertise was recognized officially. He was given the rank of sergeant and assigned to maintain weapons for a Free French unit. The final months of the war were a blur of movement and activity. Marcel and Claire followed the advancing armies, always a few kilometers behind the front lines, always ready to repair weapons, to modify equipment, to solve the technical problems that arose in combat. They saw the liberation of one town after another, watched the French flag raised over buildings that had flown the swastika for 4 years, witnessed the tearful reunions of families separated by war. When Marcel and Claire finally returned to Clermont-Ferrand in late 1945, it was to a city transformed. The factory had been bombed by Allied aircraft targeting German military production. Their apartment building had survived, but many neighbors had not. The streets they once knew were filled with ghosts and memories. Marcel stood in front of the factory ruins one cold morning in December, looking at the twisted metal and shattered concrete. This place had been his prison and his opportunity, the source of his weapons and the site of his daily humiliation. Now it was just rubble, another casualty of the war that had consumed so much. Louis was gone, arrested in August, and died in a Gestapo prison. Henri, the young worker arrested after the ambush, had never been seen again. Of the small cell Marcel had recruited at the factory, only 2 survived to see liberation. The cost of resistance had been high, paid in blood and lives that could never be recovered. But standing there, in the cold winter air, Marcel also felt something else. Pride. He had not been a soldier, had not started the war as a fighter, but he had fought nonetheless. In his own way, with his own skills, he had struck back against tyranny. The rifles he built had armed fighters, had killed enemy soldiers, had contributed in some small measure to the liberation of France. Claire joined him, her hand slipping into his. She was thinner than before the war, her face marked by hardship and loss, but her eyes still held that spark of defiance that Marcel loved. They stood together in silence, remembering, grieving, and beginning to think about what came next. Marcel never returned to factory work. The war had changed him in ways he was still trying to understand. Instead, he opened a small machine shop with compensation provided by the provisional government to resistance fighters. Using his skills to repair equipment for farmers and businesses trying to rebuild, he found a measure of peace in creating things rather than destroying them. The rifles he had built disappeared into history. The resistance was officially disbanded, and weapons were supposed to be turned in to regular military authorities. Some were catalogued and stored in arsenals. Others were kept as souvenirs, hidden in attics and basements across France. One rifle, according to local legend, found its way to a small museum in Clermont-Ferrand decades later, donated anonymously with a note explaining its origin. The ambush that made Marcel's rifles famous was recognized officially in 1946. A memorial was erected on the mountain road where it occurred, listing the names of the resistance fighters who participated. Marcel's name was there, carved in stone, along with 15 others, a permanent reminder of that desperate, violent day. Claire worked as a nurse in the rebuilt hospital, using the skills she had developed in the resistance medical station. She rarely spoke of the war years, preferring to focus on healing rather than remembering wounds. But sometimes, late at night, Marcel would wake to find her sitting by the window, looking out at the city, and he knew she was thinking about Antoine, about all the others who hadn't survived to see this peace they had fought for. The years passed. France rebuilt, the scars of occupation slowly healing, though never completely disappearing. Marcel and Claire had children, 2 daughters who grew up in a free France, who learned about the occupation in history classes rather than through lived experience. Marcel tried to shield them from the worst stories, wanting them to grow up without the weight of trauma he and Claire carried. But he also wanted them to understand. On the anniversary of the liberation each year, he would take them to the memorial, would tell them stories of the resistance, of ordinary people who found extraordinary courage. He never claimed to be a hero. Heroes, he would say, were the men and women who died fighting for freedom. He had simply been a machinist who knew how to work with metal and had refused to accept that occupation meant surrender. In 1965, 20 years after the war's end, Marcel received a visit from a historian researching the French resistance. The man, a professor from Paris, had heard stories about the weapons built from aircraft parts and wanted to verify the details. Marcel agreed to an interview, speaking for hours about the technical aspects of his work, the challenges he faced, the innovations required. The historian asked if Marcel had kept any documentation, any drawings or notes from his weapons construction. Marcel shook his head. Everything had been done from memory, calculated in his head during long nights at the factory, executed with the precision that came from years of experience. There were no blueprints, no written records. The knowledge existed only in his mind and in the few rifles that had survived. That interview led to others. Marcel became reluctantly a minor historical figure, invited to speak at schools and memorial events. He always felt uncomfortable with the attention, insisting that his contribution was small compared to those who had died. But he also recognized the importance of telling these stories, of ensuring that future generations understood what resistance meant and what it cost. Claire supported him through these years, understanding that speaking about the war was his way of processing trauma that had never fully healed. She watched him age, saw the way his hands, once so steady at his lathe, began to shake slightly. The legacy of stress and malnutrition during the occupation years. In 1973, Marcel attended a reunion of resistance fighters from the region. It was held at the Mountain Memorial on the anniversary of the ambush. Of the 30 men and women who had participated in that operation, only 12 were still alive. They gathered around the memorial, old now, grey-haired and weathered, but their eyes still held the memory of that desperate fight. They shared stories, laughed at old jokes, and wept for the absent. One man, a former resistance commander, gave a speech about courage and sacrifice, about the importance of remembering. But what struck Marcel most was the silence that followed, as each person stood with their own memories, their own ghosts. Years later, when Marcel was an old man and the war had become distant history, studied by new generations who could never fully understand, he would sometimes sit in his workshop and remember. He would remember the cold factory floor, the weight of fear that never left, the sound of gunfire in the mountains, and the faces of the men who had fought beside him. He would remember Louis's steady hands and quiet courage, Antoine's fierce determination, Henri's young face before he was taken away. He never claimed to be a hero. Heroes, he would say, were the men and women who died fighting for freedom. He had simply been a machinist who knew how to work with metal and had refused to accept that occupation meant surrender. But in the quiet moments, when he held a piece of steel and felt its weight and potential, he would remember that sometimes the greatest weapons are not the ones built in factories by the thousands, but the ones built by hand, in secret, by ordinary people who found within themselves the courage to resist. The winter of 1943 had brought desperation to occupied France. But it had also brought something the Germans could never manufacture or requisition, the unbreakable will of people who refused to forget what it meant to be free. And in that will, in that refusal, in the hands of a thin machinist who turned aircraft scraps into instruments of resistance, lay the seeds of liberation that would eventually sweep across all of France and restore the nation to its people. Marcel Beaumont's story is one of thousands from that dark time, most of them never recorded, never celebrated, never remembered beyond the families who lived them. But each story, each act of resistance, no matter how small, was a thread in the fabric of freedom that eventually covered France once more. The Germans could occupy the land, control the factories, patrol the streets, but they could never truly defeat a people who refused to surrender their identity, their dignity, and their determination to be free. And sometimes all it took was one man, one rifle, and the courage to believe that resistance mattered. That belief, more than any weapon, was what ultimately won the war.